For 32-year-old Stacy Robinson, Mount Holly felt like home. She loved her town. She loved her family. She loved her 2 little girls more than anything. She had married Joshua, the boy she'd known since high school, and for years their life looked ordinary and warm. Neighbors called them a sweet couple. Church friends smiled when they saw Stacy at the potlucks and the preschool bake sales. She taught little children. She made painted signs to sell at craft fairs. She took pictures with her daughters and laughed easily in those photos. That normal life is where this story begins. But under the ordinary surface, a slow darkness gathered. It did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through tiny, almost invisible moments. It showed itself as strange medical visits. It showed itself as nights in hospital waiting rooms. At first, nobody understood. The first alarm came after their older child was born. Stacy started feeling off. Her pulse would drop. She felt weak and dizzy. Doctors ran tests and told her family they did not know why. The explanations were vague. The symptoms were real. Friends launched a fundraiser to help with mounting medical costs and to cover what insurance did not. They posted updates. They prayed. They hoped for answers. But the health problems kept coming. More hospital stays followed. Then, in one terrible summer, a fire gutted much of the family's home. They lost nearly everything. The flames took more than possessions. The blaze left the family shaken and under new financial strain. The GoFundMe page, which had begun as a way to keep the lights on and to buy formula and medicine, grew into a record of bafflement: dates, procedures, hospital bills, overnight ICU stays. The story looked like a household slowly being strangled by debt and illness. People who loved Stacy could not see how the pieces connected. No one could imagine the full shape of what was forming in plain sight. Stacy was young, but the doctors took her very seriously. She was admitted more than once with dangerously low heart rate and pressure. On at least one terrifying occasion, her heart stopped. The monitor flatlined. Nurses raced, and for a while the family lived on the ragged edge between grief and relief. She survived. Then she had a pacemaker implanted. A pacemaker for a woman not yet 30 was jarring. It felt final. The device was presented as the solution to an electrical problem that medicine could not otherwise fix. In the record books it made sense. In hindsight, the pacemaker became a different kind of evidence. It became a testament to a prolonged injury that had been pushed and engineered. Looking back from later pages in the investigation, every unexplained collapse, every odd episode of low blood pressure and slowed heart could be read as something other than a strange disease. They matched the effects of a substance not normally on a toxicology panel. They matched the slow, repetitive assault of a chemical when taken in measured doses. It was a pattern, but at the time the family simply called the doctors. They kept the appointments. They prayed. They paid. Joshua worked as a flight paramedic. He had emergency training. He had knowledge of how medicines changed a heartbeat. The job gave him access and familiarity with drugs and with how to treat and how to hide an injury's true cause from those who did not suspect foul play. His colleagues admired his calm under pressure. The community respected the uniform. No one imagined that someone who could save lives might be the person who had been slowly damaging one life from within. Secrets have a way of hiding in plain sight. They live inside the ordinary details: a bottle on the counter, a quick trip to the store, a glass of water left on the nightstand. And when death finally came, it arrived in a way that at first seemed to confirm the doctor's fears, not anyone's worst suspicions. On the evening that changed everything, Stacy was discovered unresponsive on her sofa. Joshua called 911. He told different people slightly different things about where he had been in the hours before he found her. One friend heard that he had gone for a walk. Another was told he had been outside to lock the cars. His mother-in-law was told he had been working at the kitchen table, and that when he turned he saw Stacy slumped and blue. 4 versions of the same evening. 4 small contradictions. They multiplied into a single loud question. When paramedics arrived, it was clear she was not breathing. She was rushed to the hospital. Machines ran, staff worked, and then the pronouncement arrived: cardiac arrest. For many in the community, the death fit the medical story they already knew: a woman with an implanted pacemaker and a history of collapse whose heart had finally given out. Police filed an initial report. The case looked closed. Yet there were choices made in the dark hours that others found unsettling. Joshua declined an autopsy. He was a registered organ donor, which meant that a small tube of blood remained preserved before cremation, just in case. But refusing a coroner's exam and moving quickly to cremation created a flurry of questions. Why rush? Why refuse the very investigation that might give a family answers? The cremation proceeded within days, and within that same narrow window, Joshua submitted claims on 2 life insurance policies with him as sole beneficiary. The timing felt like a wound reopening for Stacy's parents, who were grieving and stunned. Their daughter's funeral was paid for by them. Their son-in-law's detachment seemed cold to almost everyone who watched. The speed with which money moved out of the house and into boat loans and paid vacation bookings made neighbors look twice. People started to whisper. Where grief should have been, there was, to many, a remarkable absence. The persistence of a mother would change the course of the case. 9 months after her daughter's death, Susie Robinson applied a pressure that law enforcement often sees only in determined relatives. She wrote to the state's insurance investigators. She said the money, the speed, and the inconsistencies did not add up. What began as a claim of potential fraud turned the gears of a deeper inquiry. Insurance investigators are trained to follow dollars and motives. They pull receipts. They dig into medical claims. They speak to friends and to coworkers. Their work can seem plodding. But sometimes it is the methodical unease of an investigator that exposes what others missed in an emotional rush. The insurance agents found themselves pulling at a thread that would not let go. Because Stacy had opted to be an organ donor, a life share center had preserved a vial of her blood. It was routine procedure. It was also a stroke of fate for justice. That small sample survived the cremation. It sat like a sleeping witness in a lab cooler until someone remembered it. Investigators sent that vial for an expanded toxicology screen. Routine tests were clean. Nothing in the standard panels showed up. The initial laboratory reports could have led the case to a quiet close. But this was not a routine case. The lab ran specialized tests that reached beyond the normal suspects. The more they looked, the more a pattern emerged. The results returned with a number that made an experienced toxicologist sit up and take notice. The concentration of a decongestant, commonly used in eye drops, was many times higher than anyone would expect from normal use. Numbers like 30 to 40 times therapeutic levels do not occur by accident. They suggest deliberate exposure. The chemical found in Stacy's blood had an ugly property. Used correctly on the eye, it is safe. Ingested, it becomes something far more dangerous. In repeated small doses, it wreaks havoc on the heart and can mimic natural cardiac disease. It is a poison in plain sight. When a toxicologist explained the chemistry, the investigation flipped. What had looked like a natural progression of illness began to line up like a planned sequence. Episodes of fainting, of low blood pressure, of confusion, of slow heart rates, all became pieces of an engineered story of decline. Someone with medical knowledge would know exactly how incremental dosing could produce these effects without leaving obvious fingerprints. In court documents and interviews, prosecutors would later point to the defendant's paramedic training as the very thing that gave him both knowledge and access. He had the capacity to understand which tests would not pick up the substance. He had the familiarity to dose carefully, to make collapse look like disease. He had motive, say investigators, when they layered the medical picture over his financial choices and his relationship history. Context tightened around another local tragedy that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. Weeks before Stacy's death, a neighboring case made headlines. A nurse in a nearby county had been arrested for poisoning her husband with the same type of common eye drops. The media talked. The public spoke about shock and horror. Investigators noticed the eerie echoes between the cases: similar chemicals, similar circumstances, similar official early conclusions that gave way to darker truths. Court files later show that within days of the other case making the rounds in local news, Joshua had discussed, in darkly specific terms, how eye drops could be used to cause harm. He had made comments to coworkers that were more than idle talk. Those comments and that knowledge would stand up in later interviews and in pleadings. They shaped a narrative that would not let the defense speak in only the language of accident and illness. Arrest arrived more than a year later. The charges were severe: first-degree murder, insurance fraud, false pretenses. Investigators pieced together a mosaic from lab reports, witness statements, financial records, and a pattern of behavior that leaned away from chance. When law enforcement executed that arrest, the community's image of their quiet suburban life jolted. Bond was set high. But then, in a twist that infuriated many, bond was posted and the accused walked free for a time. The legal system moves in its own rhythms, and the posting of bond is a grim chapter in too many criminal stories. Once free, the defendant did not retreat into silence. Instead, he moved in ways that suggested either delusion or bravado. He spent money that reeked of the life insurance's immediate fruits: a new boat, trips, the payoff of a mortgage. Photos of an easy smile and sunlit vacations circulated. Friends and coworkers whispered. Judges and lawyers watched the bank statements. To Stacy's parents, those purchases felt like active wounds inflicted anew. What came after was chilling in its escalation. Harassment of Stacy's parents began. The man who had been accused took to following them at events. He videotaped family gatherings. He sent intimidating packages. He tried to reshape the public narrative with his own stories, some of them bizarre. In one grotesque episode, he reported a staged kidnapping, an account that collapsed under police scrutiny. He claimed to have been ambushed, bound, and injected with an unknown substance. He pointed fingers at his in-laws to make them appear as aggressors. Police investigated and found the report unsupported by any verifiable evidence. It looked orchestrated. It looked desperate. Then, in a move that stunned even hardened prosecutors, his own child suffered a medical crisis where the same kind of compound was detected. Tests found the common decongestant alongside other substances. The child survived, but the incident raised the stakes from suspicion to public alarm. The prosecutors alleged that these acts served a dark purpose: to isolate the children from their grandparents and to muddy the waters of accountability. Courts later found patterns of abuse and neglect and revoked bond. Custody decisions shifted. The daughters were removed from his care. The legal calendar thickened with hearings and new charges. Through it all, Stacy's memory lived in small human things. Her mother posted a private note about birthdays missed. Friends recalled pumpkin patches and laughter, and the feel of a warm kitchen. Those gentle remembrances, shared in brittle, public statements, stood in stark relief to the reports of cold calculations and boats paid for in cash. The contrast between the life she had led and the one her death allowed to be funded helped fuel outrage. Investigators, judges, and jurors usually prefer evidence to sentiment. Yet feeling matters in the arc of the public story. It motivates witnesses to keep speaking. It keeps attention fixed on a case when other headlines crowd the news feed. This story, at its core, is also an account of how modern forensics and careful administration of ordinary procedures can stop a would-be perfect crime. That preserved vial of blood was the pivot. Without it, many pieces might have remained unjoined. Without a mother's persistence, the trail would have been quieter. Insurance investigators are sometimes the first to suspect that a death is more than nature, because money leaves tracks that grief does not always conceal. Their remit is narrow but relentless. They follow claims and look for inconsistencies. In this case, that narrow persistence became the crack through which a broader inquiry could pass. The toxicology lab, asked to look beyond routine panels, found the invisible agent. A routine organ donor procedure, filing and freezing a sample, became the single object that turned an ordinary death into a prosecutable crime. The trial preparations moved through many phases. The prosecution worked to link motive, means, and opportunity. They presented a portrait of a man who had the knowledge to weaponize a common medicine, the motive tied to insurable benefit, and the opportunity presented by a household and its everyday routines. The defense contested these links. In courtrooms, every witness's tone, every date, and every receipt could be cause for a small victory or a setback. Meanwhile, the community watched. Local reporters wrote about counseling sessions and courtroom strategy with the kind of sober curiosity reserved for stories that cut through the everyday noise of traffic and school calendars. The family, meanwhile, balance grief and the requirements of litigation. They petitioned for custody of their grandchildren and, step by step, sought to reclaim some sense of stability for the girls who had lost their mother. The narrative contained other troubling episodes that suggested the defendant's capacity for risk. Less than a month before his arrest, an emergency landing occurred after a small fire aboard a medical helicopter. Investigators later implied that sabotage of medical equipment might have been an act of chaos intended to divert attention, or staging. The timing fed prosecutors' theories. He had been suspended at work and later fired in the wake of that, and other accusations. Each of these events added texture to the portrait prosecutors sought to paint, a man increasingly unmoored as scrutiny tightened. When bond was revoked, the system took another step toward a protective posture, for the victims, for witnesses, and for the process itself. Courts sometimes hold defendants without bond where the evidence suggests danger to others, and judges weighed that risk here. Subsequent filings documented attempts to intimidate witnesses and to create false narratives. State attorneys argued that the defendant's conduct while out on bond showed repeated patterns of escalation, not remorse. Those arguments carry weight in a courtroom because they suggest the person before the judge remains a threat, not a contrite citizen. Through all of this, the girls grew up under an impossible shadow. Their ages shifted from small children to adolescence, as legal calendars advanced. Decisions about custody and care were not abstract to them. They were lived. Their grandparents, John and Susie, fought to keep them safe and to preserve memory and routines that might give the girls some sense of continuity. Friends and community members contributed to college funds and to the immediate needs that followed the removal of a parent's daily care. This human scaffolding around the children mattered more than headlines. It mattered because children cannot care for themselves and because justice delayed can become cruelty multiplied. At the heart of the case is a lesson about how ordinary objects and ordinary trust can be turned into instruments of harm. Eye drops, a bottle on a bedside table, an otherwise mundane device for comfort and hygiene. In the wrong hands, these things can become parts of a plan. The legal story is also a cautionary tale about how thorough suspicion requires not just emotional intuition but methodical checking. The mother's hunch led to a formal complaint. A lab's willingness to look deeper led to a scientific answer. Investigators connected the domestic to the forensic in ways that show how multiple institutions, hospitals, insurers, labs, and courts, must sometimes act in concert to uncover the truth. The case also raises questions about how communities react when someone they trusted is accused of monstrous acts. Colleagues and neighbors struggled to reconcile the paramedic who once saved lives with the man accused of destroying one. It was a dissonance that many find impossible to digest. Yet it highlights an important point: people can present presents of goodness in some arenas and harm in others. The social script of a uniform and a friendly neighbor can be very different from the private script that unfolds behind closed doors. In the quiet moments between hearings, friends remembered Stacy as a mother who loved crafts and coastal afternoons, a teacher who read stories with a soft smile. They scrolled through photographs of small hands on birthday cakes and of a woman with bright eyes holding a camera. Those images, tender and ordinary, resisted the dehumanizing force of the headlines. They reminded anyone who would look that the center of this legal maelstrom was a person with a life and loves abruptly cut short. As the legal process continued, the prosecutors kept returning to the data points: the lab numbers, the payments, the timing between death and cremation, the early insurance claims, and the defendant's post-arrest spending. Each piece, taken alone, might be explained away. Taken together, they built a frame that investigators believed could not be the result of coincidence. The defense presented other theories. It is the nature of criminal trials to have two competing narratives. The jury's role is to weigh them. The judge's role is to keep the trial fair. The press's role is to report carefully. The family's role is to survive as justice slowly moves. Outside of court, the case sparked conversations about the limits of routine toxicology screens and the need for clinicians to consider unusual exposures when a patient's symptoms resist tidy diagnosis. It spurred discussions in some medical circles about how everyday over-the-counter agents can become lethal when misused. And in the insurance world, the case was a reminder that fraud investigations can have life and death implications. The officials who investigated say bluntly that without the preserved blood sample, and without a vigilant mother, a life insurance investigation might never have found its way to a murder prosecution. By the time the trial calendar extended into later years, the community had changed in small ways. Neighborhood routines resumed. The girls lived with relatives and went to school under protective arrangements. The family that had once gathered for Sunday dinners now sat in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. The man who had once sprinted into burning buildings as a medic sat in a jail cell awaiting further proceedings. The public watched and waited as justice and process moved forward. This is the story of a life ended and of the long, stubborn work that followed. It is about the way ordinary details can either conceal or reveal truth. It is about a mother's refusal to accept easy answers and about a lab technician who checked a sample twice. It is about how a community faced with horror tried to hold on to something like decency while its people argued over what had happened. At the center was Stacy, the teacher, the crafter, the woman who loved her children, a person whose absence created both quiet grief and a fierce determination for answers. As you listen, remember this: systems matter. So do small acts of persistence. A preserved vial, a complaint to a state office, a toxicologist willing to run an expanded panel. Each was a tiny gear inside a machine that eventually creaked into motion. The broader lesson is hard and bitter. Some harms are engineered to look natural. Some perpetrators know exactly how to manipulate systems designed to help. But even careful plans can falter when ordinary people do the small, stubborn things that justice sometimes requires. Stacy's story shows both the cruelty of an engineered death and the stubborn work that can bring light to where darkness was intended. For now, the case continues to wind through the courts. As of the latest public filings, the accused remains in custody and legal proceedings proceed. The daughters grow older in the care of relatives who keep their mother's memory alive. Friends still share photos at holidays. The community still asks the same questions: how could this happen, and how can it be prevented? There are no easy answers. There is only a record, dates, lab numbers, witness statements, and the memory of an ordinary life turned tragic. But there is also a quieter record, the small acts of love that keep a family's name from being swallowed. Stacy Robinson's light still lives in those acts. Her laugh echoes in videos on phones. Her crafts hang on walls in homes that remember. And her case stands as a reminder that sometimes justice is not automatic. It is pursued piece by people who will not let a life be quietly erased.